So we are here today to talk about fostering state and local government collaboration. And by that, we don't just mean collaboration within the government sector, but outside of it as well, with the nonprofit sector and others, communities with which the government engages and serves. And it's really this sense of collaboration is really what the future of California elections is all about. When this effort was created, it really, in many ways, was sparked and germinated by a number of conversations that we were having with state policymakers and other key stakeholders in this arena who said a couple of things. One, that we really don't need to do anything to improve elections in California. They're pretty solid. And two, that there's no way we're ever going to make any improvements because nobody in this space wants to work together. And that seemed not plausible. It really seemed like we could have all of these smart, good-hearted people together in a room to collaborate, and that's indeed what happened. So I just want to very briefly share, for those of you who aren't as familiar with the Future of California Elections model, how that works. There are a set of folks really representing three sectors: election administrators, civil rights organizations representing various communities, and good government groups working together to establish relationships among their sectors. Initially, there was a set of shared goals that the group developed together. Each year, the group works together to prioritize a set of goals for that year, whether they be efforts that are moving through the policy arena or implementation of new practices. And then they really work to collaborate together on the whole life cycle of various elections policies and practices. So at the early stage of developing a policy idea, they work together to say, hey, what would the registrars think about that? What would the civil rights groups think about that? And working all the way through the policy process. And then on the implementation side as well, getting together to make sure that they're all coordinating and coming up with the smartest ideas together for how to implement policy. And then on the back end, actually going out and evaluating what's happening in the field and working with researchers to design research that reflects the needs of and the questions and concerns of the election administrators, of the civil rights groups, of the good government groups, to really understand what it is that we need to be evaluating, and then using that to feed back into the system and create new advances. We're talking today in this panel about various types of collaboration, and we're wanting to identify best practices. And I just want to identify a couple of best practices that I've observed within the Future of California Elections. One is when this group first got together in 2011 with a lot of trepidation, skepticism. We made a couple of conscious efforts to build the collaborative. And one of them was that there was this sense that nobody agreed on anything. And so we decided to identify consensus. Where were the areas of consensus? What does everybody want for elections? What are the goals? And it was really fascinating to see that probably 95% of what various sectors said that they were interested in overlapped with the other sectors, that there was a tremendous amount of consensus. So a best practice that I would suggest when you're working across sectors is to dig in on where those areas of consensus were. We put all of the other areas in the bike rack. So I know in LA we're supposed to say the parking lot, but in the Bay Area they say the bike rack. So we moved those places where there weren't consensus away and off the table, and just didn't bother with those, and really focused on where there were areas of consensus. And then early on, there was a clear effort to create a number of shared achievements. The earliest achievement was establishing together the roadmap, which identified 10 principles that everyone agreed with. but the sense that we can do this together. We're working together as a body. We're accomplishing things together. And then each year, the group has gone back and really identified those accomplishments and celebrated them together. And I think that's been really important in creating a sense of cohesion among the group. And those shared experiences and accomplishments have created a sense of trust and relationships that each member of this group can go back to when times get tough. And there are times of dissent, and there are times when not everybody agrees. But because of that trust and those shared accomplishments that have been built up together, they can navigate points of non-consensus. So those are a couple of best practices that I wanted to observe from future California elections. The rest of our panelists today are going to share other models of collaboration in which they have worked, and also share some best practices for all of us to be using as we attempt to collaborate across sectors. So I'm going to briefly just share a very brief introduction to each of our 5 speakers and what they'll be talking about today, and then we'll start with our first speaker, and we'll have time for questions at the end. So our first speaker, Neil Kelly, who is a member of the Future of California Elections, is also the Registrar of Voters in Orange County, which is the 5th largest elections jurisdiction in the nation, right? And in his free time, he also runs the California Association of Clerks and Election Officials and also the National Association. We should give you more titles, Neil. Today, he's going to be highlighting his community working group in Orange County. We also have Dr. Beatrice Solis, who is here from the California Endowment. She is the director of the Healthy Communities program for the South region, and she is going to be talking about 2 different case studies that highlight collaboration models that she has helped to seed with the California Endowment. We will next be hearing from Ardis Bazin, who is going to be discussing the Voting Accessibility Advisory Committee, which you all may have seen. She was officially sworn into today as one of the first members of that committee. We will next be hearing from Deanna Kitamura, who is also a member of the Future of California Elections, and she'll be talking both about FOS, as we call it, and the Language Accessibility Advisory Committee. Deanna is also at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Los Angeles, I should say. Finally, we'll hear from Brian Newby, who is the Executive Director of the United States Election Assistance Commission. It's a new post for him. He's been on board for since November, is that right? Previous to that, he was in Kansas, Johnson County, is that right? Running elections there for 11 years. And he's going to be talking about efforts at the EAC for community engagement. So let's move to our first panelist, Neil Kelly.
Good afternoon. I'm glad to be the person standing between you and wine. So I'm going to try and make this brief. Thank you, Catherine, for the kind introduction. And I want to talk to you about the collaborative efforts that we made in Orange County to expand our community working group, which at the time were 2 small committees that, let me just make sure this is all working, that focused on the 2 statutorily required committees that you would have as an election official, which are the language advocacy groups and then the disability rights groups. When I took over the office in 2005, my immediate predecessor caused a lot of issues with the community. And it was difficult to try and step back and repair those relationships. And so this is really kind of a good example of collaborative work that our team worked on to try and repair those relationships, but this is not the panacea for how you would do collaboration across the board. I'm speaking to the choir here, I'm sure, but the 4 main categories of our work in the Orange County Election Office fall into these 4 categories. Candidates, education, outreach, and voting, and what I want to focus on is that outreach effort to make sure that we're getting the word out not only on voting, but voter registration and the work that we do in the office. So the community input prior to 2010, which is when we really launched this initiative, we had those two community advisory groups that I talked to you about, and it was really fragmented. There was really no structure to it. There was really no formal design to those committees. I think the community felt that their input was not really being heard in a good way. And so we wanted to fix that and repair it and grow it. And growing it was the biggest challenge for us. There was frustration among community leaders that elections were being conducted in the county with, well, they gave input, but their input was not being addressed across the board. And then finally, kind of seeking that dramatic change to that statutory compliance is something that was a big challenge for us. And we'll talk about that heavy lift here in a second. So we went from those two categories I talked about, and the desire was to get to 10 categories. But how to get to those 10 categories of having these broad groups from the community come together at the same table, provide input, and it wouldn't be duplicative, or you know, people wouldn't be doing their efforts in this group crossing each other over. And so there's challenges to this collaboration. That's what I want to talk to you about. The first was trying to maintain that group momentum. So the group was operating in those silos before, and we wanted to bring everybody to the same table. But I think that's one of the biggest challenges to collaboration, is that if you don't have that group momentum, people start to pull back and they don't feel like they're being collaborative together in that group. And that's something that FOSA has done a great job at, by the way. Finding time, I think my colleagues in the room would agree that there's these requirements in the law that we have these committees, but finding people to engage and be a part of those committees is tough. And so finding ways to make their time valuable. Competition among the groups was really a big challenge for us, because you may have two language advocacy groups that feel like they're doing the same work. And so how is their input really being used in the county, at the county level? And then finally, the accomplishments being delayed was something that we didn't want to do. We wanted to have this roadmap moving forward and making some good effort towards it. So the community election working group is what we came up with to expand it to these 10 groups. And so we weren't just having those two inputs. And I want to talk about three basic things that were kind of a challenge for us in just building that group. The first was expanding, and the difficulty with working with a diverse set of members. And I mean that in a good way. There's different personalities, and finding that common ground is sometimes tough. And so you have to be able to find ways to do that and to show that you are moving forward. Competition, I've talked about that a little bit, and the duplication of those efforts. And then success, having a structure that really shows that you're putting things in place at the county level with their input. That was sort of the core that we were trying to build upon. So this is what we did, and this is what I think might be, you know, something as a takeaway for this. We built some very comprehensive electronic and printed brochures and materials to reach out to the community, and we started going to community meetings and reaching out to these individuals who had been alienated before, and started extending a handshake to try and to mend these relationships. And I bring up the brochure. You might think, well, it's just a brochure. No, it wasn't, because this is what we were really trying to show the community, that we were working towards collaboration where we weren't before. And there's 5 things I want you to take away from this brochure in particular. So let me open it up here. And the first is having a vision, a mission, and a structure. We didn't have that before in the county, and in our advisory group didn't have that. And we really articulated that and shared that vision and that mission with these groups and what we were trying to accomplish, and did that in a way that there was structure. Consistent meetings, minutes that are associated with those meetings, and showing that there was progress. That was really important, I think, to the community, to show that that was occurring. The third is to vision what we could accomplish together. Could we have increased polling places in certain areas? Could we provide additional language support? Could we change signage in the polling places? Things that they wanted to do as a group together that were not being done at the county level before. And we've made tremendous progress and made improvements by collaborating together and showing them that we are achieving these successes. And then finally, sharing with them that the duplication of effort is a good thing. Because if you have multiple groups working on the same thing, disability rights as an example, and making sure you have accessible polling places, that's a positive thing. It's not a negative thing. And I found that in collaboration, sometimes that's a challenge. If people think that they're duplicating their efforts, they may pull back. And we didn't want to be doing that in the county. So these were the two areas that we had before, right? And I talked to you about that already, the language and the disability. And we grew to these 10. And you might not think, I know some of my colleagues in the room probably don't have all of these together, but some do. City clerks on the same group as language advocacy groups. If you think about it, city clerks are a real asset to their communities. And they're really sort of the cornerstone of democracy in their communities because they're working on meetings and elections within their communities, and that's really important. Poll workers, it's something that we really should be thinking about when we're collaborating with these different groups, because something that the poll workers may think is a good idea, or the language groups might think is a good idea, may cross over. The other ones you can see up there, the two that I want to point out are the student and youth groups, because they have provided a tremendous amount of input towards the process of improving elections in Orange County. They have a lot to offer. And then veterans groups, because we've done a lot of outreach with veterans groups as a part of this process. So just finally, some of the key takeaways from our collaborative effort to build this community election working group, or we call it CUE. We don't take anything away from Pew, but we like the acronym. Communicating the vision, kind of avoiding that temptation to muddy those outcomes, is something that's very important. Building trust. I think, you know, when Catherine talked about this at the beginning, when some of the groups came together initially in FOS, I think there was that, I don't want to say distrust, but there was some gaps that needed to be closed between election officials and some of the advocacy groups that came on board, and I found it to be a great partnership in working together. And being consistent and maintaining that momentum. We have our group meetings once per quarter. There are 25 plus people that are a part of this single advisory group that works well together. And the thing that is very important for us is, and the collaboration is not just working in the group level, but oftentimes we'll work individually with members beyond just that group discussion. And we get a lot of input from them individually as well. We do have all of our information on our website. We maintain a very robust website just for the Q group. If you're interested, there's the URL. And then finally, a couple of pages just to show you. Now, this is the selfish part that's coming out. We have a very good relationship with the Department of Justice, and we want to maintain that. And for the collaborative effort for the election officials, by clearly cataloging everything that you do in this collaborative effort is very important to show that you're substantially complying, and we want to go beyond substantial compliance with respect to what DOJ is looking at. So thank you very much.
Hi, good afternoon. Beatrice Solis here at the California Endowment. It's really great that you're enjoying this place, which is absolutely wonderful, and it is actually meant for all of these meetings. This is the place where people need to convene and meet and talk about really challenging ideas and issues that are of utmost importance in our region. So I'm going to go ahead and continue with my talk here. Just a little bit about the California Endowment. We're a health conversion foundation. So one question that you're probably going to have in the back of your mind is why is the California Endowment at this particular table? So definitely, hopefully we answer that question by the end, but we'll expect others to ask me that question. So again, we're pretty big, long time history in expansion and coverage for healthcare. Super excited that as of March, expansion for undocumented in California is going to happen. For youth, but where we really punch the hole in terms of our mission is the second part, to promote fundamental improvements in the health status of Californians. And so hopefully you'll come away with understanding what that means. So for the last 5 years, we've been engaged with what we're calling Building Healthy Communities. It's a 10-year investment, and for a foundation to focus 10 years on 14 places across California that are very diverse is a big deal. And that process has really shaped and changed how we think about community and how we think about place. And what we know, and there's volumes of data that show where you live matters, and it matters a lot to your health, to your opportunity. So those are the places where we're making our investments. So now going into the work, why do we think that it's important to engage and involve people in their communities for systemic change. Well, across those 14 sites, at the endowment, we believe each site has a unique flora and fauna and system in place. But when you begin to connect the 14 sites together for a movement, something really special happens in terms of, one, at the individual level, people recognizing that they're bigger, part of something bigger. Number two, that the issues that they're dealing with in their community resonate in other communities. There's sort of that acknowledgement, if you will. In addition to that, I would add that weaving groups together across the state really can influence policy and systems change. So part of our work at the endowment and building healthy communities is really an explicit focus on what we call drivers of change. Won't go into the theory of change there, but it's essentially two important pieces. There are 5 drivers, but 2 are really, really, really important. One is youth and resident power. And I'll talk through my examples about why that is critical when we talk about civic engagement and involvement. The other is changing the narrative. How do we begin to change the narrative on low-income communities across California as communities of opportunity and resilience? The other 2 drivers are equally important, which is collaboration, leveraging resources. So in terms of our power building strategy, this will give you a sense that we see that we have to fund and support leadership development of young people and residents to be sort of those change agents. We also need to support organizations that use community organizing as a methodology to engage young people and adults in issues that they care about that are important in their community. We need to support strong collaborations. Again, how do you learn from, let's say, a California Calls that can then go to another Building Healthy Communities organization that may not have, you know, sort of the deeper understanding of integrated voter engagement, but how do we bring them together to learn at a much faster pace? How do we accelerate that learning? And then how do you connect organizations together to see themselves in a broader movement for change in the state of California? So we are supporting what we call voter engagement. And again, we look at it as a complement in thinking about the drivers that I just mentioned, collaboration, that this doesn't work by itself. It works because people come together that care about their community and want to address systemic change and power differentials that exist in their community. And I'll provide a very specific example of power differentials that exist across several communities in California. So IVE, our big partner in this work, is California Calls. I see Carla out there. And also PICO affiliates and what we call our Building Healthy Community organizers on the ground. So why IVE? And you probably already know, but for a health funder, it's kind of important to say this. It builds power and constituency. It really gets people out that haven't been engaged consistently in voting. In addition to that, it has a longitudinal effect, which is that once you begin beyond the election cycle to realize that engagement matters, and it matters a lot to change, it really changes the frame around opportunity and leveraging resources that are needed within a community. So then you're building that power base, if you will. It also has a way of increasing and bringing along the next generation. We recently conducted a poll across California among young people, and again, you know, there's a larger narrative that young people are disengaged or millennial, they're only thinking about themselves. But the polling data that we found is that they want to be engaged, but they want to be engaged in issues that they care about. And they will be very active in that. So how do we, again, change that narrative around young people? Another reason why IVE is important, it's not GoTV. It's not like a one-off relationship, but it's really something that's really important in terms of really building relationships and sharing data and information to really look at the metrics that can happen across that. So I'm going to give you 2 quick examples, and I know I'm already halfway through my talk, so I'm going to talk a little bit faster, which is a challenge sometimes. So I'm going to use 2 case studies. One is in Long Beach. through Building Healthy Communities. As I mentioned, we're 5 years in. We've been supporting LANE, and a project of LANE has been Long Beach Rising, which achieves a high level of civic participation, voter engagement, community organizing among historically underrepresented communities through leadership development, boards and commissions training, participatory budgeting, youth engagement, and its annual convening, which happens to be tonight, the People's State of the City. The need for collaboration came out of understanding that the current political landscape didn't necessarily reflect the diversity of Long Beach experience. And many people in Long Beach did not feel that it would make a difference to participate in the political process. So many low-income and poorer residents weren't going to the polls. So this progressive movement was really to bring about this broader table of residents, workers, teachers, students to come together to really talk about how do we engage in this civic space where in the past they might not have felt that it was important. So with leadership development, it is really those boards and commissions where people in their lives can, a parent can see themselves as being a site counselor, or they can be on, or a young person being on a youth commission. All of those opportunities that government has available to them for people to get engaged, many in Long Beach felt like that was not an opportunity for them. And so creating that space for them to be engaged and see how boards and commission training can get them into that pipeline. As a result of the last election in Long Beach, I would say there were at least 20 Building Healthy Communities partners, and we're talking about residents, nonprofit leaders, young people, were appointed to boards and commissions that are more reflective of the diversity of Long Beach, which is a huge, huge win for Long Beach Rising. Another thing that I'd like to leave you with in terms of what best practices or takeaways that are important is that, you know, bringing organizations together and collaboration is really hard because you can't have collaboration, and we know this as a funder, just based on funding, bringing people together. That doesn't necessarily bring trust. It doesn't necessarily bring interest in terms of long-term relationships. And, you know, relationships are really, really hard to build. So what we've learned in order to sustain these sorts of collaborations is that you need to really give time, because people have been so disenfranchised historically from the election process that in order to re-engage them, you have to do more than education. You have to do more in terms of building relationships and really bringing people in that can be those big change agents. The last case study, I know we have some folks here from City Heights, so big shout out to City Heights. And what I want to inspire you with this particular example is that there were a cadre of young people that felt that the school to prison pipeline was a problem. But how did that lead to civic engagement and involvement? Interesting, quick short story. Now I'm supposed to stop, but I got to tell you this story because it's really inspiring and why it is so critical to engage young people in this process. Young people were receiving tickets, truancy tickets for $250 because they were skateboarders. These are kids that are just skateboarding and trying to go to school, trying to go to X to Y place, and that was a driver to the school to prison pipeline. So once they collected data, found information, lifted the profile, got city officials, got the mayor to listen to their concerns, were able to advocate for skate parks and safe places and to build bridges with elders in the community to support that skate park. You may say at the end of the day, oh, well, it's just a skate park, good thing. No, these young people have tasted what it means to have power. They have tasted that they have changed themselves to desire to go to college, to move on and be involved civically, and to vote, and to make a difference and to understand that their vote counts. So again, huge lesson, deal with issues that are really important in the community, find that space and the relationship to then be a partner to help move and engage people for a longer period of time, because we know the narrative in many communities and low-income communities in California, which has been a challenge, is the lack of trust of government. And for many historical reasons. So how do you begin to build that trust? How do you begin to have sometimes those difficult conversations that take time and understanding to build something larger in a movement? So I will leave you with that. Thank you.
Okay, it's working. Okay. Just started too quickly. I've had lots of years of experience with advocacy in lots of arenas. In the voting area, I actually got involved in voting access when the Help America Vote Act was passed. I was invited by the Secretary of State at that time to participate in actually doing the original state plan. So I've been involved in voting advocacy for a long time. One of the things I've noticed that happens the most is it does take time and effort to collaborate with many different people. Each segment of the population has their idea of what they see as the best way to go when it comes to voting access, and that's whether they have a disability or whether they speak different languages or whatever. And I've always strived to listen to all sides of the conversation and hopefully work together with them. I've been part of the Los Angeles County Voters with Access Committee as well as on the state VOC for a number of years. And I have felt that it's important to hear both sides. One of the biggest issues I've had is I like to reach out to my community and talk to a lot of different blind persons about their feelings on the issues. And what happens sometimes, there's a large difference between people who have really low vision, or high partials, or no vision, and each one has different voting experiences. And I try to take that back. But unfortunately, you know, when you're meeting with a group with a lot of other people with disabilities, not every point that you bring across is going to be seen as a viable point. Well, then when something gets done, like last year there was a couple of voting laws that got passed, and not all of the items that we wanted from the blindness community were put in those bills. And my community lashed out at me. They said, hey, you didn't advocate hard enough. You shouldn't have been said that that was okay. Well, I didn't say it was okay. I wanted more. But you have to agree to disagree on some points. And you're not going to make everybody happy that you try to be their person. So I'd like to encourage more involvement. Unfortunately, it seems like not very many people are willing to participate in the disability groups in the different counties. I wish each county in California would have a good voting access committee, but I've heard that many counties have trouble finding people with disabilities that are willing to serve on these committees. And it does take a time commitment, particularly if the meetings are in person. One thing that has worked really well for me in Los Angeles County, originally I had to go to Norwalk, and I live in Burbank, which if you're taking access services, it can take you a couple hours to get there and 3 to 4 hours to get home, depending on how many share rides. But a couple of years ago, they started having conference calls. So now I can participate in most of the meetings, which has been really helpful. And the state VOC as well, they allow people to participate in person or over the phone. And I think creating these extra efforts to be able to allow more people to participate from a wider area really does help. And I think it's important on the part of the state officials really to know who to ask for advice on certain things. And I really appreciate it when I get an email from the Secretary of State's office asking, well, do you think this effort would be good? Do you think having a, how would this work on the accessible website registration, et cetera, letting us actually look at things and give our point of view. And I think working together, even when it's difficult to communicate for a whole community, is the best way to go. And I'd encourage everyone to participate in the process and reach out to people with disabilities and get them to be part of your program. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Again, I'm Deanna Kitamura with Asian Americans Advancing Justice Los Angeles. We are the largest civil rights organization in the nation focused on issues affecting the Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. As Catherine said, I'll be focusing on the FOST Collaborative as well as the Language Accessibility Advisory Committee to the Secretary of State. Catherine gave you a little bit of background in terms of the FOST Collaborative. And she was being far too modest in her role in it. The FOST is actually her brainchild. She's the one who had the vision to believe that election officials and advocates could sit at the same table, develop shared priorities, and work together. Now, as Catherine said, we don't always agree with each other, but that's okay. We respect one another, and we all have the shared understanding that we want voters to vote, and we want the system to be smooth for voters. And so that's why we understand that working together makes sense. Now, there are a lot of benefits to being part of the FOST Collaborative and to working collaboratively. While many of the members had long time history of working together, working in a partnership, in a collaborative, really changed the nature of our relationships. I can tell you firsthand that because of FOST, my organization has much stronger relationships with election officials as well as the other civil rights groups and the good government groups. Additionally, FOST members have benefited from streamlined and coordinated discussions on a number of different election issues. We have weekly calls covering different issues related to election administration, voter registration, and voter experience. And those weekly calls provide a regular forum to discuss immediate election issues as well as to talk about long-term ideas and projects. And this convening right here, the FOST conference, is a great example of a project, a collaborative project. You'll see on the first page of your program a list of the various the committee members, the planning committee members for this conference. And this is the 4th or 5th annual conference that we've held. And each time we've had at least one election official. Usually, if it's an off election year, we'll have more. And then a number of different advocates. And because of that mix, you get to see the wide variety of speakers and topics that we've been able to have today. So today is a great example of the collaborative. And not surprisingly, we have a lot of discussions about policies. Today we've talked a lot about the new voter motor bill, and so I'm going to use that as an example. But the process that I'm going to talk about, it applies to the vote by mail reform bills that have come up, as well as the vote center bill that's up in the Senate bill that's in going through Sacramento right now. With regards to the new voter motor bill, we knew that the Secretary of State released it and was having a lot of was sponsoring it and was having a lot of discussion with various stakeholders. The Secretary of State's office used the FOST calls as a way to talk to a lot of different stakeholders at the same time. And during those calls, we were able to talk about what we thought made sense. People were also able to raise concerns. And advocates were able to hear the concerns of other groups or the election officials, or why it made sense to the election officials. And so it was really great discussions that we were able to have. And then outside of the calls, a subset of FOST members were collaborating to discuss various changes to the bill. And AB 1461 reflects a lot of this discussion that FOS members had, and I know without a doubt that FOS members will continue to have discussions in terms of the implementation that DMV will eventually adopt. And so that's an example of how our collaborative works in terms of policies. And in terms of relationship, I talked about a little bit about the strengthening of our relationship. And for my organization, being part of the collaborative has changed the nature of our relationship with election officials because we actually now see ourselves as partners with the election officials. And I'm going to give an example of the Department of Finance report regarding elections, as well as the state controller audit of Orange County in 2015. And I know that Neil can do a better job explaining the problems with that report and the audit, and Kathy Darling Allen and other people in this office can tell you in minute detail the problems with that report. But I want to tell you why we got involved in that, why the FOS collaborative, why people outside the election officials would care about that report and about the audit. Now, both the audit and the report indicated that vote by mail usage was up, and therefore the election officials had saved money. And we know that, yeah, okay, vote by mail usage is up, but as we heard today, 75% or so, I can't remember exactly, but a large number are actually dropping off those ballots, going to the precincts and dropping off those ballots. And so that means precincts can't close. Poll sites have to remain open. So right now, as far as I know, there has been no cost savings because vote by mail usage is up. And so CACEO, the Association of Election Officials, they sent their very pointed letter to various entities, but the FOS collaborative felt it was also important to send a letter as well because we all understand that voters benefit when elections are run smoothly, when you have ballot machines that work, when you have the proper number of election staffers that are employed in the county. And so Vince Hall, the executive director of FOS, he drafted a letter for the FOS collaborative, and a number of organizations signed on to that joint letter, and that was sent to the Department of Finance and the Budget and Appropriations Committee of the Senate and Assembly. And a group of FOS members met with the state controller regarding the Orange County audit, and after the meeting, the controller deleted the vote by mail offset savings in her audit. And some organizations within FOS actively work on election funding issues, but organizations like mine, we would never have gotten involved in this issue. FOS makes us better informed and better partners. And so it's really important to have that kind of collaboration. And now I want to shift to the Language Accessibility Advisory Committee, and it's also called the LAC. From 2013 to this morning, it was an informal committee to the Secretary of State. And I think a lot of you saw that a number of us were sworn in today. It's actually an offshoot of FOS. In one of our FOS work groups, the LAC was raised as an idea by a colleague of mine. And the idea is to ensure that language access issues are not an afterthought by the Secretary of State or by election officials generally. FOS members encouraged the creation of the LAC, and then FOS members who were involved on dealing with language access issues joined the LAC, and then it was opened up to other organizations. Staffers for the prior Secretary of State agreed to monthly informal meetings, and to make it convenient, the LAC members dealt with all the logistics, from proposing the monthly agenda to taking notes. We even set up the conference lines and sent out the reminders of the calls. Now, the new Secretary of State, he formalized the LAC, and you saw that again, that we're all sworn in. And there's a number of folks in the back table over there that we talk to on a monthly basis. James Schwab, I saw earlier in the room, Jana Lean, Joanna Southard, and John Ivey. And so we're going to continue to have those discussions with them as a formal group. The committee can provide, for those election officials who do not have a LAC or a local advisory committee regarding language assistance, the committee can provide a lot of benefits to you. For example, in 2013 and 2014, the LAC reviewed the translation for the Secretary of State's online voter registration website, and beta tested translated pages. And so I encourage you to get involved, get people involved if you have language needs. And for community groups, what I want to suggest is that if you have issues with regards to anything election related, ask for a meeting. First, get a group together and ask for a meeting. I've never been turned down when I've asked for a meeting. And if there is problems getting a meeting, make it easy for them. Deal with all the logistics. Make sure you have short agenda and make sure you have specific asks. And if people are, your election official is still resistant to meet regularly just with you or a small group, follow Neil's lead. Ask them to follow Neil's lead and create a larger group where you'd be part of that group. One last point I wanted to make is to remind election officials that policy changes, even ones that are administrative, can profoundly affect voting access to a community in different ways than you might predict. And therefore, election officials should create community advisory committees to get community input. And the example I want to provide is requiring proof of citizenship has a disparate impact on naturalized citizens because the naturalization certificate is not supposed to be copied without authorization. Therefore, if a naturalized citizen does not have a passport, that individual may feel he or she can only register at the registrar of voters office. And if the naturalization certificate is lost, it can take over a year to get an official copy from USCIS. And this is one example of how unintended consequences can occur if you don't get community input. So I'm asking election officials to do so, to get the community input, because you might not fully understand the ramifications of your decisions on different communities. And that's all I have to say within my 10 minutes.
Okay, I think I'm working here. So a couple things I want to speak to briefly. First of all, from the Election Assistance Commission, I'll discuss what that is in a little bit. And I did work as an election official for 11 years before that. But I also worked at Sprint for 20 years. And one of the things, and I won't talk completely about disabilities in my time, but it was 25 years ago, right about this time, I was working on our proposal for the California Relay Service, which was my gig. Back in the old days, kids, it was called Dual Party Relay Service, but then it was Telecommunications Relay Service. The city of Sacramento had stolen our NBA basketball team, the Kansas City Kings, and so I took a little bit of glee in stealing back their arena, the Arco Arena. That's where our relay center was. I'm not quite sure what's happened in those 25 years. It was a pretty stressful time. I can vouch that I can still remember the day I officially became bald, and it was a very stressful time. But one of the things we did very well there, we had a cost advantage over AT&T, but we had a strategic advantage because we incorporated the deaf community in our operations. We hired people who were deaf in key roles. We had advisory committees made up of people who were deaf as well as hard of hearing and speech disabled. And so I saw a lot back then the value of being very inclusive and also developing relationships that help for the overall service. So kind of fast forward to some of the things now at the EAC. I probably, in my old job, I leveraged more, never thought I would have leveraged how much we used phones and in that job in terms of text messaging and that sort of thing. But in my new job at the EAC, I never would have thought I would have leveraged as much about event management, relationship management as some of the jobs I had at Sprint. But first of all, just to step back with the EAC, and I would imagine at least one commissioner was here last year. I don't know for sure at FOS. But in the past year, there's been a lot of things that have happened at the EAC, specifically now that a year ago there had just been 3 commissioners named. I would point out in the program it has a little bit of, it's already a little bit outdated, that tomorrow the keynote speaker will be, instead of Vice Chairman Tom Hicks, it will be Chairman Tom Hicks, and it will be his very first time that he will be presenting as chairman. So that'll be kind of exciting. I mean, I think that's good for him. He forego an opportunity to speak at an election center conference that ended up having a conflict so that he could be here tomorrow, and he'll be the keynote speaker tomorrow. Also, in that time frame, besides appointing me as executive director, we also hired General Counsel Cliff Tatum, who came from the election community as well. He was the election administrator in the District of Columbia. We had some kind of had a review, I guess, by Doug Lewis, who was from the Election Center, and also someone who was on the Presidential Commission on Election Administration, Chris Thomas, who was also the Director of Elections in Michigan. And they did a review of the agency, kind of gave a report to the commissioners about this time last year, and drew the conclusion that we needed more representation from the election community. And that was part of what led to me and Cliff coming. And some of the things about the EAC, I would say, is you probably, if you wonder what the EAC does, you're not the first person to wonder that. And the EAC has a very specific mission. So related to the Help America Vote Act, there are certain things we do. One is we administer the Help America Vote funds that were part of what was discussed earlier that came out of the Help America Vote Act in terms of grants. California has more HAVA funds than many other states. In fact, I think the most of any state. And that's just because California is in the process of implementing some of the things related to HAVA, and that money will probably be used up very quickly. Beyond that, we're also responsible for certifying new voting equipment and for driving that process. Also, the agency maintains the National Voter Registration Act federal form and state-specific instructions. So if there ever is a change to the form itself, that would be done through rulemaking with the agency. And then we provide clearinghouse for information. So it's best practices, if you want to think of it that way. But I think we're trying to kind of come into our own a little bit with what our role is at the agency. So there was this period of time that the agency didn't have commissioners. And what has happened is you've got a group of people who are still working there as employees who are very devoted to the agency. They are very devoted to the spirit of the agency, but less so have experience in elections. And so one of the things we're trying to figure out is what is that role now as we're trying to broaden our reach again. Are we creators of content? Are we aggregators of content? You know, putting two people together. Are we both, which I think we are both, and then when are we one or the other? And so one of the things we've been doing is driving this idea of trying to be 45 days out from whatever election administrators are going through and trying to create programs to prepare. So we just did a webisode, which is really going to be a podcast. We hadn't gotten it into the iTunes store yet. A webisode on vote by mail and voting by mail issues. Some of the people in this room are on that webisode. If you go to the EAC website, you'll see it's about an hour-long video and then some other little snippets. And that's a big deal right now. We've created a page on our site called votebymail.gov. If you go there, it's directed to a page on our site to talk about voting issues by mail. And that was one of the first things we did in this, what we're calling the Be Ready 16 series. So the next thing we'll be doing is another webisode and also a rollout of a revised election worker manual. We'll be doing that. I'm sure Commissioner Hicks will be talking about that tomorrow. We also previously had created a roundtable on continuity planning, and we really brought up the key officials in close states, kind of what to do if you have a recount, what to do if your race is really close, what to do if you're in a swing state. We had several secretaries of state, including Secretary Williams, who was on a panel this morning. He was on that roundtable. We did a data summit a few months before that where we tried to take advantage of the fact that we have a lot of data. It's one last thing I didn't mention that the EAC does is we maintain a every other year survey of election officials and election data. But what can be done with that data? How can it be useful? How can it be mined? And we had a summit of different election officials talk about that. And so beyond that, we have a couple other things that are planned. We have a kind of a disability forum that we will be doing in a couple months. I'm sure, again, Chair Hicks will talk about that tomorrow. We are also looking at a minority language summit, doing the same kind of thing. These are two key things we have coming up in the next 2 months. We've brought together and having regular meetings of the Standards Board and the Advisory Board, so both of those will be meeting again in the next 2 months. So the big thing, I think, is really that the agency itself is very active and is very active in trying to understand that role of do we create content, do we aggregate content. So to the extent that you have content ideas, we have an email. It's beready16@eac.gov, or you could just email me, bnewby@eac.gov, bnewby@eac.gov. And we really would like those kinds of ideas. The last thing I think we're going to try and do as we go through this year is create more of account management roles within the agency. So we have people who do functions, but what we'd like to do is have someone who's the primary contact for local administrators, the primary contact for state administrators, the primary contact for people who are disabled and working with disability groups, and et cetera. And so we'll be rolling that out later this year as we look at our organization. So I ran through a bunch of stuff. I know we want to lead to questions, so that's our scoop.
Yeah. Well, let's have a hand for all the panelists. Okay, we're going to have roaming mics to take questions. And let's see, I'm not seeing any hands yet, so I'll start with a question. We're going to have about 20 minutes for questions now. All of you very helpfully gave some great proactive tips about how you have seeded collaboration. And I wonder if you could flip that a bit and think about, what do you wish those who need to collaborate with you and who potentially could even challenge you, what do you wish that they knew about your sector or your community, and how could they be more effective in working with you?
I think one of the things I would suggest is that if they have a question, anything related to accessibility, to talk to us as advocates. Sometimes people do things, they put up things on their website which aren't accessible, or they put together a voting machine, or they do something else at the county level without asking us, and then we have to go and complain. And it'd be much easier on the counties to come to us first and say, hey, we're thinking of making this change. Would you please look at it and see if you think it's something you can add? Because a lot of times people don't understand what kind of, like for example, a sample ballot, which ones are really accessible and what kinds to do, audio, print, whatever. And sometimes if they talk to us as a community, we can give them suggestions what would work for our community. Now, of course, they should also talk to other people with disabilities, because we don't always know what is beneficial to all of them. But ask us first before just going ahead. I guess that would be my biggest thing to advise.
Yeah.
I would add, well, also to that, I just want to echo what Deanna was saying earlier about reaching out to your election official. But within that context, understanding the timelines and deadlines that we face as election officials. And I think that's really something that's not widely known. For instance, 90 days out from Election Day is essentially when candidate filing closes, and that's when all of the ballot assembly is really coming together in a very quick fashion. So if you're wanting to make changes to the sample ballot, or you're wanting to do something to address disability community, for instance, like was being discussed, you really need a longer lead time. So just understanding those dynamics, perhaps going back 7, 8, 9 months before Election Day, is really important. And I would just also say that every election official that I know, and I'm proud to represent CACEO throughout the state, is committed to ensuring fair, open, and accurate elections, and doing so in a collaborative way. So.
Well, one thing, I probably go back to my old job as election official in Johnson County, Kansas, and I know that what I found very helpful was when voters, regardless of the issue, stopped and talked to me, especially they come in for advanced voting. That would be a time when they would stop and talk to me. And you have an opportunity in this very busy year to approach your election administrators. And the best thing, reason I bring that up mostly is that it's a little unique in California in some ways, but just about every election official is looking at new voting systems, one way or another. And so introducing yourself to that election official while you stop in to vote and say, hey, I know you're going to be doing this, and I would love it if I had a chance to be related to a panel or related to your procurement process in some way. I think that would be a very strong thing. That I gathered a long list of people in that regard in Johnson County who are probably wondering, he never calls, he never writes, because I've moved on. But that was something, I had a committee already formed for both from just a user community, technical, people of technical interest who were users, people from different disability groups. I had these committees already formed, and they were from people who had approached me while they just came in to vote. And so, because I didn't know who to talk to. So just by approaching me, I would recommend you approach your election officials that way.
In terms of the Asian American community, I just wanted to say that just understand that it's extremely diverse. Here in LA County, we have 8 Asian languages covered. Each of those communities are very different from each other, although they do have overlapping similarities, but they're very different. And then the other thing, we just want to echo what Artis was saying in terms of talk to us beforehand, because how something affects a community might not be so obvious. So for example, in the Asian American community, vote by mail use tends to be high. So you might think, oh, we're all going to be supportive of vote by mail, but also the ballot rejection rate for vote by mail is a little bit higher in the Asian American community. So you have to think about various like little subtleties when you make changes, because you want to be able to address all the parts that affect the various communities.
So I would just add that, creating authentic, real places within the administrator's ability that brings it from the ground up rather than going to, which is a huge challenge because you have timelines, you have deliverables, you have things that you have to get done. But within that year, where can you authentically create those relationships? Because it's important to deal with those sandpaper moments and the historical legacy that is around voting that are really important to kind of look at and hear and reflect upon. And then lastly, I would just add that latch on to community activities that are already happening. So you have First Five, you have the California Endowment, you have the California Community Foundation. You have foundations that are entrenched in California that are sometimes place-based and sometimes working on civic engagement activities. So where you don't need to create a table, be part of a table, because that just elevates the relationship. It helps elevate the understanding of where there could be synergies and conversations to improve. As well as for, I think just mentioning earlier is, sometimes people don't understand, and we can't assume that folks will just come knock at your door because there's a lot of fear in coming and knocking on that door. Who will be that frontline person? Will they look at them in a weird way? Will they greet them in a way that's respectful? The soup to nuts is you really need to think about all that, because all of those things are easy turnoffs and validation sometimes to sentiments that communities feel that there's not an openness to have or to raise the flag on certain particular issues that might be affecting the community. And so addressing assumptions is not a good thing because they just kind of linger there. So how do you go in head on, with a foot forward to deal with those sandpaper moments, I think is a good way to flex, sort of that muscle that goes both ways for those authentic conversations.
Can I just give a quick in-the-weeds example of that? And you're raising a good point, because we, through our community election working group, really were not thinking about certain things. We were in the bubble as an election official. And this is it may sound minor, but it was very important. And that is when sample ballots are created in English, you have all the translations that are coming right behind that. And the language community are going to get an English sample ballot first, followed by their language sample ballot. But they may be wondering, why am I getting the English sample ballot when I've requested a language ballot? So through our collaboration, suggested messaging was created to put on the sample ballot that really helped to provide an understanding of how that works. And it was because of the collaboration that we were able to get in the weeds and do that. And so if you're not knocking on the door, you're not making those effective changes. So it was really important.
Really terrific advice, everyone. So as we shift to questions from the audience, I know we've got 5 very bright panelists. We'll try and limit perhaps each answer to 1 to 2 panelists so that we can cycle through a number of different questions. So I see a hand in the back there, and we can make that our first question.
Hi, Jonathan Stein, soon to be a voting rights attorney and program manager for voting rights at Asian Americans Advancing Justice Asian Law Caucus. Mr. Newby, this question is for you. First of all, thank you for traveling out here to join us, and thank you for your openness to our input and our ideas. I have the question that I think you're probably expecting, which is that in your position as the executive director at EAC, you recently allowed 3 states to require documentary proof of citizenship when using the federal voter registration form, instead of enabling voters in those states to attest to their citizenship, as is done in all other states. If you look at our signs here at FOS, expanding participation is one of our core values. Lowering barriers to voting is one of the reasons why we exist. So I have to ask you, what do you think will be the impact of your move on voter participation in the 3 states in question?
You want to say what the 3 states are?
Kansas, Alabama, and Georgia, I believe. Do I have that right?
That's right. Well, I can speak to it some, and then there's some I can't speak to because it is a subject of a lawsuit. I would start with one thing, that talking about proof of citizenship itself, there was a mentioning of people who are naturalized citizens, and in Kansas at least, you can take a photo of the naturalization certificate. And I actually won an award from the League of Women Voters using iPads. We loaned them iPads to make sure that people who are naturalized citizens were registered to vote during that ceremony. I think I would, though, step back and say that what you've characterized that I did is not technically what I did. That I approved the request to add the state-specific instructions from 3 states into the instruction portion of what's on our website. So the instructions were what was in those state laws, and I think that the organizations that pass those state laws, which would be legislators, in my opinion, they should answer that thing that you're pointing to. But we also, as I said, we are, if you look at the law, we work in consultation with states for those instructions. We support state election officials. We support local election officials. So I felt that I should accept the state-specific instructions. The thing that shouldn't be implied there, that I was in any way endorsing those laws. So beyond that, I don't know what to say, because I mean, there's probably some element of the lawsuit. But my focus, I think, was very narrow in the request to accept the instructions. And I really do think that, I'll step back a little. I was on a city council, and I compared this to a landfill issue. And perhaps just because it's not because of the topic. But I used to be on a city council. Right when I became elected city council, there was a landfill expansion issue. And in that landfill expansion issue, I was the only person who voted against the expansion. And I had a lot of advocacy directed my way from residents who lived there. And I certainly was empathetic to that. But I was looking more at the kind of the nuts and bolts of the agreement itself, and I didn't feel the city or the residents were getting what they should have for that agreement. And whether you liked my position on that or not, I think that if you looked at how I made a structured decision, I think if you looked at that, you'd think, well, you know, I may not agree with the conclusion, but 9 times out of 10, I'm going to feel good because he went through this structure. I did go through a structure with this. So the worst thing you should ever hear from an election official is trust me. I wouldn't even ask you to do that, but I think that over time, I think if there's other places where I'm making decisions, I think you'll feel good about them, frankly. I mean, I think I did. I don't know what the outcome will be. I think that it's where it ought to be right now, frankly, the issue. And that is in a court situation. And so I think we'll just go from there. I don't know that I can really speak too much of the court part, though.
Jen, want to be sure checking the side of the room. Okay. Kim.
Hi, my question is for Dr. Solis, and maybe Deanna wants to answer this as well. I just wonder if you can talk a little bit about how, within the California Endowment and your civic engagement work, you address the challenge that's particularly one here in California, where so many people are not citizens, are not on a path to citizenship. How do you advise our groups here to engage folks who won't be able to vote? Is there advice you can give us?
Yeah, I think what we know is that there are many mixed status families, and you have citizen-born children. They're U.S. citizens. And how to engage young people from those families that may have parents that are undocumented is really important. And so writing off, if you will, or assuming that folks are not documented is an assumption that needs to go away. And I think at the California Endowment, what we've been trying to do through our Health for All work is change the narrative on inclusion rather than exclusion. So how do you be inclusive in approaches that don't make assumptions on people in terms of their abilities of where they sit or stand in society? And we move this narrative around calling everybody a Californian because you're living in California. If you go to Manuel Pastor's data, if we look at patterns of demographic change, we haven't really seen a lot of change in California. It's pretty stable. So if you look at immigrant families, they've been here for 10 or more years. And so we have a lot of young people that are US citizens that are feeling the stress and strains of what their parents have gone through because of discrimination, problems with access to a multitude of things that impact the ability of young people to get engaged and involved. And so what we've learned through that particular campaign statewide is how do you use the narrative of inclusion and not assumptions. The other piece is that we're learning from community in terms of how to be inclusive in local elections, particularly around school boards, and where there is traction to make change around school board elections, because we have children that are attending school, and how do you make sure that the parents, regardless of their immigration status, are able to vote and able to have that local regional approach. So I think, again, statuses change, right? And we never know when opportunity, we have DACA, maybe DAPA will happen, I'm not sure. But that opportunity and desire from community to change their immigration status and to be American is very, very deep. And so, again, there's this, resiliency frame that I sort of challenge in terms of looking at people as assets as opposed to the paper that they hold. Because they're in our restaurants, they're working very, very hard in this economy, oodles of data that sort of demonstrate that. So how do we be more sort of inclusive in the conversation when it comes around elections and engagement?
Oh, the one thing, I guess two things I'll say is that our voter engagement coordinator is here, and she'll be able to discuss this a bit better than I can, but we use students under 18 as well as adults who are non-citizens in our Get Out the Vote efforts. They're doing phone banking, and we found that when you're talking about, for example, Prop 30, the students were able to talk to voters and say, hey, I can't vote, but you can, and you can support me. And so they were a very strong voice and very civically engaged in that. The other thing is I want to just take this opportunity to remind election officials that AB 817 allows you to recruit lawful permanent residents to be poll workers. And so I encourage you to do so. And so that's another way that non-citizens can be very active in our election process.
And now student LPRs too.
That's right.
Yep.
Time for one more question. All right, not seeing one from the audience. I'm going to ask you all to think about one very, very quick answer. We want a quick answer when we come back to this, which is give a shout out to somebody who you think is a good collaborator. Think about that for a second while I review some of the best practices that we heard today. And I'm summarizing here, but some of the best practices: identify consensus among those you're collaborating with. Identify a shared vision and a mission. Set up a structure for collaboration. Create shared achievements and celebrate those. Maintain momentum and have regular meetings. Give people time to become voters. Engage them year-round. Engage them in issues that are important to them. Invest that time. Don't just ask them to vote. Hire diverse people in key roles. Take time. It takes time to collaborate. Be patient. Administrators should run ideas by stakeholders. Ask for a meeting with an elected official or other leader and be willing to plan the logistics yourself. And if all else fails, ask those elected officials to follow Neil Kelly.
Thank you.
So to go back to the question, would anyone like to give a shout out to someone they think is a terrific collaborator?
Going to be a group?
What's that?
Can it be a group?
Sure.
So I'm going to take the easy route here. I think CCEO is a great collaborator.
I'll say California Calls, because they take people in, they use data for decision making, they develop and take time to develop shared values and principles. They use technology to diffuse and build and scale up, and they take time to build trust.
Well, I've been in Washington, D.C. all of 2 months, and I know enough to be political here. I would have to say the EAC commissioners, all 3 of them, but actually people here in the room, Dean Logan, I'm sure I'll forget something because that's what I was afraid of doing. Dean Logan, Neil Kelly, Cami Foote, Scott Konopesic, and it seems like I don't know Leon Padilla, but I would say him. I'm probably forgetting somebody, but I think the California election officials, I would say, are all very good at incorporating input from the community. So I would say they're very good at collaborating.
This one's a tough one because there's so many good collaborators, but Lori Schellenberger just popped into my head the first thing when you said that, and she's out there schmoozing, I think. And I'm going to mention her because she's really in the weeds on a lot of stuff, and yet she brings all the stakeholders to the table so that things aren't missing. So
I'm going to be a cop-out and say everyone in the room because they're here.
All right, well, I'll take the privilege. I just realized I should come up with one too. So first person who came to mind for me is Secretary of State Alex Padilla, who has really, since the moment he became Secretary of State, sought in all ways to collaborate with those in the field, which has been really very impressive. Well, we want to thank you so much for joining us for this panel. It's been a really terrific conversation. I want to give some applause one final time to our panelists who did a great job.